So recording started. Okay, so let's get started. Tavo and Abri, thanks for agreeing to this conversation. You have been getting a lot more attention lately, especially after Paulogia released a video responding to your criticism of his minimal witness hypothesis. In a recent comment, you laid out your own uncertainty pretty clearly. You said something like this: is there a God? 53% yes. If there is a God, did Jesus have some divine authority? 60% yes. Was there a bodily resurrection? 50%. With that level of tentativeness on the big questions, I want to start here. Why spend so much time and energy critiquing Paulogia's minimal witness hypothesis? What do you see as the main stakes of that debate? And what outcome are you hoping for, either for your own thinking or for your audience?
Yeah, so first of all, excellent question. Second of all, thanks very much for having me on. You have a really great channel. We had a lot of pleasantries before the video started, but I did want to say again, your channel is absolutely fantastic. I'm really glad to be here.
Thank you.
All right, so let's talk about my degree of uncertainty. Now, this was kind of a cheeky comment that I posted, so I hope no one will take this too literally. Obviously, these you can't give you a percentage of certainty. But I think my point in that particular comment was to underscore that my main argument is, if you have a theistic belief or a belief that there is a theology in the world that is extant, that still exists, that is more correct, I think it's a fairly easy argument to be made that that theology ought to be based on Jesus. Now, I have a few specific reasons for that, but again, that's kind of what I was reflecting in the comment. Now, am I certain about some of the things that I think about? Is there a God? Is Jesus did he have some sort of divine authority or some sort of divine message or divine mandate from God? That's another question. On both those questions, I think I'm fairly uncertain. As most people who have been part of my channel for a while know, I'm generally speaking, a lifelong atheist. And so I still allow for quite a bit of latitude in terms of the degree of uncertainty that I have. Now, in terms of the other question that you had is, what is my goal for making these arguments if my degree of certainty isn't that high? I think so I've been engaging with these arguments for quite a few years, mostly from the atheistic side of these arguments. And I recently sort of decided that I think a lot of arguments that are at least have a proclivity towards inclining that there's probably a God in the universe and that Jesus is probably had some sort of divine authority. That's a relatively new conclusion for me, but I feel like the analysis that points in that direction is underrepresented. In other words, if you look at Christian apologetical voices that are commonly sometimes overrepresented in the lay public debate, I think a lot of those voices are sort of making similar arguments that it's good to believe in Jesus for reasons that are inherently theological. And I think for many people who are like me, who are sort of in that gray zone of not being super certain about these questions, some of the arguments that I'm putting out there seem like they're underrepresented in the general lay public debate. So my goal is to highlight those arguments more. The other reason why I wanted to put these arguments out there is because I think that as somebody who was an atheist for many, many years, I kind of absorbed this party line of atheism, which is that the evidence for any religion, particularly Christianity, is very flimsy. And so that was kind of what I believed for a long time. So it was a bit of a switch for me to say, I'm not as certain about that anymore. And now I definitely think that the evidence is not as flimsy. And then the third reason why I wanted to put out these arguments is really for my own intellectual, theological, spiritual, if you want to say, personal growth. In other words, I'm hopeful that there is an audience for a bit more of a lukewarm theological perspective and some of my takes, which are, I think, spicy, but sort of a little bit more guided by uncertainty. I hope there's an audience for that. But if the only person who gets something out of these debates is myself, then I'm still okay with that. In other words, if I learn a lot theologically, that's fine. If I come out of a lot of these debating experiences and a lot of these conflictual scenarios in terms of like the Hegelian dialectical model of conflict, and I come out with a more atheistic perspective, I'm totally okay with that as long as I've learned from the experience.
So is it true that the reason why you are engaging in these debates is more about joining the conversation, and because you think you have something to offer, and so you put it on the table, and you want to see what reactions you get? Maybe other people can learn from your input, and maybe you can learn from other people's reaction. So what's on the stake is not necessarily whether you want to believe or not to believe, but to kind of expand the knowledge base, and more like an education, for a purpose of education. Does that sound right?
That's pretty close. I would say just, a slight refinement of that is, do I believe that my perspective belongs in the debate? Not necessarily. Do I believe that the arguments that I've specifically made belong in the debate? I think those arguments are underrepresented. I think they do belong in the debate. It's not that I have so much to offer personally. It's really that I think the arguments are valid and are underrepresented.
Okay. So I mentioned about Pelagia's response video. So after reviewing Pelagia's response video to your critique, what strikes you as the strongest point and the weakest point in his minimal witness hypothesis as you understand it now?
Yeah, those are excellent questions. All right, so what is the strongest point that he makes? And I'm just a little bit. We're going to talk about minimal witnesses, and I'd love to talk about some other things. And the reason is just because I've had a lot of content on the minimal witnesses argument and the pros and cons of it. So first of all, I'd be remiss if I didn't say Paulo Gia is a tremendously insightful individual, very compelling, very persuasive. I thought his critique of some of the things that I said was very much on point. The main thing that I think he got wrong is I think he was sort of taking some statements that I made and saying, as refutations, these statements don't work. And the fact that these statements don't work as refutations of the minimal witnesses argument means that you don't understand the argument. Instead, I think a better sort of characterization is that what I was offering initially was a critique. I was very specific on that point. I said, these are not refutations, they're critiques. And I think that now those are sort of I think that's maybe the strongest point that Paulo Gia said during his video about me, was maybe some of his analysis about post-bereavement hallucinations. I think for me that did move the needle slightly. I still think that he has probably switched his opinion based on some of the other videos that he's released and some of the other things that he said since he put out his initial video. His initial video said 30% of people who are bereaved will have experiences where they see, hear, and talk to the decedent, right, the person who's passed away. Now, that's almost exactly a direct quote from him. So when I think he's probably backed off on that. I think the literature supports that that's not an accurate claim, that if you go with a number as high as 30%, you're probably including not only post-bereavement sensory hallucinations, but maybe quasi-sensory experiences. And the literature seems to acknowledge that there is this bifurcation. They're not all hallucinations when we talk about post-bereavement hallucinations. They're not all what we think of in that category specifically as a true sensory hallucination. Some of the experiences that people have are quasi-sensory experiences. In other words, just sort of a sense that the loved one, that the deceased person is still there. So I think we've probably both moved a little bit in that regard. I think I had a pretty strong point to make about the 48.24.1 Ulpian's Digesta, which is a dissertation on what Roman laws were in regards to crucifixion victims. I think Paulo Gia is probably wrong in how he cites that law, but I think based on some of the statements that he's made, he would sort of agree to that. And he would agree that that's not something that's, and he sort of like pushed that out of minimal witnesses, even though it was an important point of his initial argumentations around minimal witnesses. So I think there's some ways that he's sort of moved in a direction. There are some ways that I've sort of moved in a direction. Like I said, his critique that I was cherry picking in my literary analysis of the scholarly literature around post-bereavement hallucinations, I think that was a valid critique. But and then the rest of the things that I would say about Paulo Gia's argument are probably like a little bit more in the realm of fairly minor quibbles. But I will say this, I don't think Paulo Gia was correct that I didn't understand the argument. I think I understood the argument. There are certainly some things that I could have explained a little better, but there are some things that I said that were more critiques than refutations, and that may have led to some confusion.
Can you see this article I put on the screen?
Yeah.
So I was reading this article earlier today, and I was kind of wondering when you are talking about sensory and quasi-sensory experiences, it seems that when psychologists are writing, these kind of papers, post-bereavement hallucinations, they would include not just what we would typically think of as hallucination, but also other more broader sensations. So, for example, the post-bereavement hallucinations of the deceased are most frequently a felt presence. We normally wouldn't think of felt presence to be like a sensory, but it says 39% to 52%, then followed by auditory, 13 to 30, and visual, 14 to 26 experiences. So what I was getting at is that when atheists or people or skeptics talk about post-bereavement hallucinations and they quote like numbers as high as 30% or 40%, maybe they were quoting from papers that not only talk about auditory, visual, or tactile, but they also talk about just like a general, a strong feeling of the deceased person's presence. And that would also be included in the percentage. So maybe that's why we intuitively think that the number is just too high. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's possible. I think the other thing that Apology uses a source, which is Camp et al. In 2020, which is a really great article, and it's also a systematic review, so it reviews other articles and kind of pulls them in. I think the point that article makes most persuasively is that these other sources, which are a little bit older, like a 1970 source, a 1990 source, probably use very different definitions of what is an actual post-bereavement hallucination. So some of the definitional lack of clarity is why these categories have shifted over time, and why some of these percentages have shifted over time, and why they have very broad ranges in some of these percentages. So I will say this: I think Apologia's argument, minimal witnesses, can work if you have a quasi-sensory experience and not a true sensory hallucination. But I think it's a bigger uphill battle. In other words, is it possible that Peter didn't have an actual sensory experience, that he just sort of felt the presence of Jesus, and therefore he concluded that Jesus had risen from the dead? Yes, I think that's a possibility. But I think it's a much less convincing argument. I think if you start from the perspective that Peter had an actual hallucination, it sounds much more persuasive. So I won't go into like that here, but there's a lot of reasons why we think that Peter's experience, if it was indeed a hallucination, which I don't personally think it was probably very atypical for what we know about post-bereavement hallucinations. Now, the other important tidbit is that in the DSM-5, the category of persistent grief disorder, PGD, was added only as a new entity in 2022. That's my understanding. And so some of those definitions have been clarified since this older literature, like Rees from the 70s, Grimby from the 90s. Some of that older literature is probably not as relevant. And what we need is a study that moves forward in a way that's not as retrospective, that's not as survey-based, that's not as biased, that really kind of goes into the realm of what post-bereavement hallucinations are, with a more clinically precise definition of what they are and what they aren't. And really the bigger question is, in the psychiatry literature, is what does that mean? In other words, does it mean something bad if somebody's having a post-bereavement hallucination? Does it mean that they'll have a higher risk of moving on to have prolonged grief disorder? We do know that some post-bereavement hallucinations, and again, I'm using the term hallucinations very broadly, are very positive and help people move on from the bereavement episode, and some are very negative and help sort of entrench people in their sense of bereavement. So that's probably enough on that for now. But there's great literature coming out. I suspect these definitions will be clarified and expanded on in future years, and we may even have a little bit more clarity in future years about whether or not the disciples had an experience that can be likened to post-bereavement hallucinations. I will say this: I think the literature is quite clear that right now it's too early to say that we have a good explanation for the disciples' experiences with the resurrected Jesus. And I say disciples broadly. I think we're talking about just Peter if we're talking about the minimal witnesses model, at least initially. It may be that we will have more clarity on that question in the future. I think right now the answer is we don't have a great explanation for what Peter experienced. If it is grief-based hallucinations, then I think the literature making that connection is, at least right now, very murky and very tenuous.
So you were saying that you don't think that Peter saw a hallucination. So how would you account for the emergence of the belief that Jesus was risen from the dead? Do you think that it actually happened? Or do you think there are other better naturalistic explanations to explain the emergence of that belief?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, do I believe in a bodily resurrection, that Jesus actually came to Peter and appeared to Peter in full physical form? I think that's, I go back and forth on that a little bit. I don't
It's a
think there's,
50%, right?
it's probably less than 50% reasonably.
Less than 50. Okay.
Yeah. It could be some sort of a visionary or visual experience. I don't know. It's not a huge part of my theology. The most important part of my initial video response to Apologia was actually at the end of the video, where I actually talk about a specific thought experiment. And, I've made this point in several other videos, that is the question whether or not a miracle actually occurred, or is a question more about what is the theological impactfulness about a chain of events or a mechanistic explanation. In other words, usually the debate between apologetics and atheists is, did God cause this, or can we explain this in with a naturalistic explanation? Now, the reason why I think that debate is not intellectually nourishing is as follows. There's always a potentially naturalistic explanation for almost every miracle event that we find in the Bible, particularly in the Old Testament, which I understand that's an offensive term, so I'm trying to switch to the Tanakh as a term for the Old Testament. So let's just think of an example of the splitting of the Red Sea, right? We can explain that through naturalistic events. So do we say it's not a miracle because we can explain it? Or do we say, well, that still falls under the category of providence? And the reason why it falls under that category is because it just happened. It's an unusual situation that happened in the right place, in the right time, just in the way that would have been necessary for a specific outcome to have been propagated from that experience. Let me put the question to you in another way, because we've had this debate in the comment section. Is there, if you and I are on a desert island, right, and we decide that there is a God, right, and we have some basic conclusions about God, would we ever expect God to intervene in the world in a way that is discernibly supernatural, in a way that circumvents the laws of nature? I think the argument is we would never reach that conclusion because it would be illogical. The reason why it would be illogical is we're specifically saying that God is the architect of the laws of nature, right? So why would God ever need to circumvent those laws? If you're omniscient and omnipotent and omnitemporal, which most people would say that's probably a couple of good definitions for the omni categories of God, then you would never need to circumvent the laws that you yourself have made for the universe. It's not a logical point. In other words, if we scratch the surface hard enough for long enough, we should be able to find a naturalistic explanation for everything that happens in the history of human experience.
That's interesting take, because when we think about the critical scholars, when they put forward some explanation for the splitting of Red Sea, such as the wind blows and the water, etc., it could be all naturalistic and it requires no miracle. But when it comes to a resurrection after 3 days in room temperature, I don't think that's naturalistically possible, because when a person dies, the decay is immediately starts to happen. And after 3 days, there is really no known natural cause that can reverse that process and brings the person back to life. So in effect, that would require a suspension or a bending of the laws of nature as we know. So it's kind of different from a wind blowing on the Red Sea at the right time, um, at the right place, versus a dead body needing to come back to life after 3 days of death. I think they are still different. And what do you think about that?
Excellent point. And that was exactly the point that I made in my response to Apologia initially. This was in a part of the video that he didn't address at all. But my question is, if we are, so here was the thought experiment that I posed at the end of my initial video to Apologia. If you believe that the minimal witnesses model happened, then I think you have to at least accept the proposition that it's an extremely unlikely sequence of events, right? Now, if we have a very unlikely sequence of events, how much is that at all kind of going towards the direction where we're calling it a miracle? In other words, is a miracle by definition something that we know is impossible, that has a 0% chance of occurring? Or is it something that just we have a mechanism for it, we have an explanation, but it just seems to happen in the right way at the right time at just the right place to make it indistinguishable from the action of providence? So let me give you a different thought experiment. And I hope that this is a more direct answer to your question. Let's say that we exhume the body of Paul, right? And we exhume the body of Peter, okay? And let's say that they both have this interesting finding where we look at their cranial bones, right? And we find that they both have tumors, like a rare tumor in their middle cranial fossa that cause them to have hallucinations and cause them to have visionary experiences, right? We could say, well, that should point us in the direction of atheism because now we have a better explanation, right? I would actually make the case that makes both of those individuals more susceptible to a visual or visionary experience. And that to me suggests that there's something very unlikely that lined up in a very, very precise and very, very unusual way to result in an apparent resurrection. Now, I like using the phraseology of apparent resurrection because it kind of nails down what I do believe in. I believe that there was an apparent resurrection. I believe there was like sort of an early proclamation of events. Now, we can go into that a little later. And I don't want to spend all the time on the minimal witnesses argument, but I do want to get on to other things. But I think that's kind of the point that I make in my video response to Apologia. If we think that Apologia has touched upon something that is infinitesimally probable, that is almost exceedingly uncommon to the point that it only happened once in human history potentially, doesn't that seem a lot like providence? So in other words, I could see somebody believing in something like the minimal witnesses model and still saying, well, I'm a theist because, we know that these events, like these visionary experiences might be exceedingly improbable. In other words, wouldn't it take essentially a miracle to have, let's say I say, all right, every belief in the resurrected Jesus was a visionary or hallucinatory experience, right? Let's say I even say that there was a group hallucination, that a bunch of people hallucinated together. Well, we know that group hallucinations are essentially impossible and are certainly so infinitesimally improbable that, that essentially we're back to kind of square one where we say, well, the only way that this kind of set of experiences could have happened, we now have a naturalistic explanation, but it's so infinitesimally improbable that seems a lot like the intervention of a god on our universe, and that still creates an apparent resurrection. It still results in the same theological set of conclusions. Now, a lot of Christians will say, "Don't, that's not a great argument to pose." But I think it's a reasonable thought experiment at least. Now, I don't have a really great otherwise mechanistic explanation for the resurrection. So you do raise a good point there. I'll have to think about that some more. That's something I've been thinking about. And that's one of the reasons why why I still allow room for uncertainty, for intellectual growth in some of the things that I've expressed. So if there's plenty of people that you can listen to online who will say, I believe in the bodily resurrection of Jesus. I believe it was a physical resurrection, and I believe in that because Jesus has moved in my own life. I don't necessarily have that set of experiences. Maybe I will have that set of experiences someday, but I still think I can advocate for the messaging of Jesus in other ways. Now, if it's okay with you, I'd like to sort of kind of shift the focus using that as a point to dovetail into some of what my beliefs are about Jesus.
Sure, but before we do that, I do have one point to make before we move away from Apologia's minimal witness hypothesis, right? And this point, I think it's something, I'm not sure if you missed it or you failed to, you know it, but you failed to mention it. But I think that the minimal witness hypothesis is not put forward as the most probable naturalistic cause of the belief in resurrection. I think it's just put forward as one possible or plausible way how it could have happened. And if we think about all the different possibilities of how the belief of resurrection could have arisen from naturalistic means, whether there was empty tomb or whether there wasn't, whether Peter saw a hallucination out of grief or because he suffered from epilepsy, or whether there was indeed a few women and Peter and a few other disciples saw the resurrection, or just one seeing a vision and then other people believe that that person did. There's hundreds of possible naturalistic explanations. When you combine that together, how do we determine that is still less probable than a miracle did happen? So that's something that I want to bring to the table and to think about. Maybe you have some good response to that.
Yeah, my response to that is that there are certainly, and I say this explicitly in my video, if we define miracles as events that have a 0%, precisely 0% chance of happening, and we define the resurrection as, by definition, also being miraculous, and therefore, by definition, having a 0% chance of happening, then we could foist out whatever very improbable theories that wouldn't be very intellectually nourishing to talk about. We say, well, maybe Jesus was a time traveler. Maybe he was a multidimensional being, right? These are ways that we can preserve the laws of nature without necessarily invoking something that is explicitly in violation of those laws. Or we could say something totally ridiculous, like maybe there was a hidden secret twin, right? Like in the movie The Prestige, and Jesus just switched places with that twin, and they stole the body. And then the twin came forward and said, I'm the resurrected Jesus. And then everyone said, well, you look just like Jesus. So they all thought it was a resurrection. So, I mean, there's any kinds of, there's any number of theories that are infinitesimally probable. I think my point of making a critique of minimal witnesses was to say there are ways that this could strengthen the argument. Now, I wrote a long email to Paul. Paul is in Apologia. And I said, here are ways that I think would strengthen the minimal witnesses argument. So I don't think we should throw it out entirely. I think we can strengthen it. I think that would be the most nourishing thing for all of us. I think we should all try to make each other's arguments stronger rather than trying to just say everything needs to be thrown out completely.
Okay, so you were going to bring this conversation to something else?
Yeah, so I'd like to this is kind of my own version of an opening statement, but I want to talk about what I am more certain of. And this is something that I hope you'll give me some pushback on. And this is the set of conclusions that to me points in the direction of Christianity being a reasonable outcome from a theistic perspective. So if you believe in God and you're trying to pick from one of the existing religions, I think it becomes very persuasive that Christianity is the best choice in that setting. Now, I realize this may be somewhat contrived, but it was at least applicable to me, and I think it's something that you'll probably give some pushback on. But, I can talk about, there are several reasons why I think this. First of all, we do have Jesus as being uniquely venerated among religious figures in other religious traditions. Now, this is something that's very uncommon. Hinduism, Swami Vivekananda, who brought yoga to the United States, a tremendously influential Hindu scholar and thinker, believed that Jesus was an avatar, was a reincarnation of Krishna. We have very high up figures in Buddhism. We have the Dalai Lama, who felt that Jesus was a bodhisattva. We have Thich Nhat Hanh, who called Jesus his own intellectual and philosophical predecessor. Islam, of course, considers Jesus to be a prophet. We have Baha'u'llah, who founded the Baha'i faith, which is a really inspirational religion. He called Jesus the Son of Man. We have Messianic Judaism that has millions of followers. Even Zoroastrianism, a lot of Zoroastrian adherents have moved toward the conclusion that Jesus had at least some degree of divine authority. So to me, we have a bunch of religions that are pointing towards Jesus, and then we have Jesus who only points towards himself. So I think if you're picking from a theology, from an existing religious tradition, it's almost certain to me from that argument alone that you would pick Jesus. All right, here's belief number 2. We do have Jesus being a unique intellectual luminary, with teachings that are still impactful and interesting from a multidisciplinary perspective. And we can prove that both quantitatively and qualitatively. Jesus is the only figure who's been directly cited by major thinkers in several different disciplines: philosophy, theology, ethics, sociology, psychology, literature. In every one of these fields, one of the main thinkers in that field in the last 100 years has cited Jesus directly. This is very uncommon for any thinker from antiquity or any ancient period, but it's exceedingly interesting to me that this comes from a theological source. And then I actually go through in one of my videos and I talk about all the
You want me to respond at some point too, because you are making more than 1 point now, right?
Sure. We can stop here. I have these are kind of 5 points, and I could go through the other points really quickly if you want to respond to these arguments as a whole.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, my next point: the modern era has brought capitulation and conciliatory perspective in most theological systems. So most theologies have moved towards relegating their own miracle accounts to something that's really sort of optional or fictional or largely mythological. Christianity seems uniquely anti-fragile as an outlier for this trend. We have the death of Jesus being a theologically impactful inflection point for Jewish life, meaning after the death of Jesus, we see a lot of very significant theological changes in the lives of the Jews. And then the last point is we have much more quantitative and much different qualitative evidence and attestations in early Christianity compared to any other religious tradition. I'll stop there.
Okay.
Thanks for letting me go through that opening statement.
Yeah, sure. So to your first point that many religions or religious leaders point to Jesus, but Jesus only points to himself, I would say that's oversimplification, because when Christianity is the most popular religion in the world, you would expect any religious leader to interact with ideas in Christianity. And the main character in Christianity is Jesus. So at some point, if they want to do interfaith conversations, they would have to talk about who they think Jesus was. And you would notice that the way they talk about Jesus is not framing him in the Christian way, but in their own worldview, like saying that he's an avatar, he's a bodhisattva. That's not really veneration, that's domestication, that's appropriation, appropriating Jesus into their own religious worldview and let Jesus become part of their worldview. I think that's part of what Baha'i is doing. They are so diverse and so widely encompassing that they include the major religions in the world. I would say that it's something closer to syncretism. And we see this a lot in the East. I have a background I grew up in Taiwan, where Buddhism, Taoism, and folk religion are all intermingled together. Sometimes it's hard to tell which tradition, which deity, or which bodhisattva is which religion. So I'm not that impressed when other religious traditions point to Jesus. If anything, it just points to other religions having a more tolerant or broader worldview that can include Jesus into their religious system. But in Christianity, it's more monotheistic. So it's more exclusive instead of inclusive. So that's how I would explain it. Do you have any response to that?
Yeah, I mean, I have a couple of responses. So it is important to note that we don't see this syncretic trend throughout all religions. In other words, we don't see Muhammad being elevated and venerated in the same way that Jesus is elevated and venerated. So I can understand you're saying, well, Buddhism is more syncretic, so is Taoism. These are actually very, very recent changes that have happened. Buddhism is not that syncretic in a lot of regards. There's, for instance, a lot of, and you know more about Buddhism than I do, but there's a lot of Buddhist antipathy towards Muslim populations throughout the Pacific Rim, so much so that people are really getting unfortunately persecuted, murdered. There's a lot of ethnic cleansing. There's a lot of religious violence. So I see your point, but if that's the case, that these are just religions trying to be syncretic, then why do they not syncretize other religious thinkers? Why don't we see Muhammad being venerated to the same degree by the Dalai Lama? Why don't we see, like, you see Jews for Jesus, right? Those are Messianic Jews. You don't really see Jews for Muhammad. No, in the same regard, you don't see Muslim followers, people who adhere to an Islamic faith, celebrating Buddha, venerating Buddha. You don't see Christians doing that. So now I will say this. I think if you're saying, well, all these other religions that are Eastern traditions are more syncretic, that's actually a very recent development. So in terms of since the era of modernity, Buddhism and other religions, including Shintoism, Taoism, Confucianism, those religions have all changed significantly in the modern era. So it's interesting that, like I said, those religions have all changed to encompass more aseptic, less theological beliefs. So in other words, all those religions did start with miracle accounts. For almost all those religions, they've sort of divorced themselves from their own miracle accounts at their origins. To me, that makes all those other religions sort of less theologically meritorious than a religion that is sort of anti-fragile in regards to modern secular pressures. So
that's a different argument, though. That's a different one than you were making earlier.
Well, I mean, the reason why I'm saying this argument is because your dispute with my first argument is that these religions are syncretic. And my point is that they aren't syncretic to a degree that they would just expropriate another religious figure just to gain followers, just to gain adherents. And my other point is they are syncretic, but that's all part of a relatively recent modern development in a lot of these religious traditions.
So you agree that it's only in recent years that these religions highly praise Jesus and try to incorporate Jesus into their own religious worldview?
That I'd have to look up more.
Wouldn't
but I
that
think
cut against your arguments there?
That I'd have to look up more. But my point is that calling these religions syncretic is probably correct in this day and age. But they certainly didn't start out that way. Buddhism was much more of a theological system. Now it's sort of been recontextualized as a philosophical system. I mean, you can take the example of Confucianism. Confucianism started off as a theology. It started off with miracle accounts. It's only recently that Confucianism has changed into a system where they say, get rid of the miracle accounts, get rid of the theological contentions, and let's just, make our school of thought very philosophical rather than theological.
Yeah, I think this worldview, especially Confucianism, it has undergone a lot of changes from when it started. But we don't want to get into that. It's another rabbit hole that we don't want to get into. But so what's the next one you were talking about? Remind me.
My next thing was that Jesus was a unique intellectual luminary.
Right. Okay. So I have a lot of responses to that. Yes, I would agree that Jesus was an inspiring teacher, but so was Aristotle, Socrates, Confucius, Buddha. I would put Jesus on the same par with those ethicists, philosophers, and just religious leaders in general. So I'm not sure how special Jesus is among these people. Are you saying that because Jesus was such an inspiring teacher, he teaches profound moral principles, that it's more likely that he was divine? Is that what you're getting at?
Well, let me ask you this question. If I said that God sent a divine messenger to humanity in an era of antiquity, wouldn't one of your questions be like, what were their teachings and how relevant are their teachings today?
Yeah. Yes.
So do you think it's also consistent with, let's say you have you predict that there's a theological narrative about a certain individual. Would you say that it's consistent with that individual having some sort of theological authority, that you would expect that they would have had teachings to pass on to humans that would be at least very advanced for their time?
I think it's a big if. If I don't normally use that kind of logic, like hypothesizing that if God wants to do something, then what we would expect to see. This is how I'm going to frame this. We have many good moral philosophers. How do I know which one has divine attributes? Because if I just start out with that, if God wants, then that's kind of already assuming that God exists, but I don't have that assumption. I don't, and to start out with theism is I don't even know who God is, what are his attributes. If I start out with that hypothesis, it's inevitable I'm going to import my biases, my previous knowledge about the religion that I am most familiar with into that idea of God, and that's going to create bias. So from a Bayesian statistics perspective, right, what we are asking is not the question should not be the probability of someone like Jesus being a highly advanced moral philosopher, given that God exists. Okay? It should be given that Jesus is highly advanced moral philosopher. How likely does he have a divine attribute? These are actually two different questions and would generate different probabilities. Are you following me on this different differentiation?
Oh, absolutely. And as I said at the beginning of my opening statement, I think the key thing is that I'm approaching this from a comparative theological lens. So starting with the assumption that the world is theistic, there is probably that Jesus is probably the best candidate for someone who had a divine authority or at least some sort of divine mandate.
But like I said, when you start out with that, it's okay as a thought experiment, but it's inevitable. You're going to import your idea of God that you already acquired previously, right? For example, Than argues that if God exists, we have reasons to believe that he would send someone as a messenger and raise him from the dead to show that he is truly divine. But that's already imported a lot of the theologies that he already endorses, right? And it's also assuming that God is singular, not plural.
Well, we haven't gotten to the idea of the resurrection yet. My point is, if you believe in God and you have to pick from one of the existing world religions, you're going to pick Jesus for this reason. Now, I do want to just give some pushback on some of the counterexamples that you offered, like Socrates, Aristotle. First of all, there's very few people who think that Aristotle was a good guy in philosophical circles. Aristotle had horrific viewpoints. He was a huge proponent of slavery. He got elevated during the Enlightenment era, largely because he was so permissive of slavery and because that was funding so many academic institutions during the era of Enlightenment. That's just, that's just a lot of people sort of recognize that in the history of intellectual thought, Aristotle had some really bad viewpoints. But let's focus on Socrates. So there are two differences. Let's take Socrates as an archetype and compare Socrates to Jesus, right? So does Socrates meet the criteria that I laid out? Right? That's an interesting question to ask. So no, and for two reasons. Number one, we talked about direct citations. So Jesus is cited directly by intellectual luminaries in several disciplines. Socrates, almost every, I think when I looked at JSTOR, JSTOR, is the Electronic Archive of Journals, over 85% of mentions of Socrates occur in the area of philosophy. So some occur in classics, some occur in history of philosophy. So Socrates is by far the most cited figure, but most people don't cite Socrates in a multidisciplinary way. They cite Socrates only in the philosophical literature. Now, so he's not multidisciplinary. He's not relevant in a multidisciplinary perspective. He's also not directly cited. So in other words, if you look at Jesus' comparison to Socrates, Jesus is cited by at least one intellectual figure in the last 100 years in several different disciplines, and also Jesus is cited directly. Many thinkers trace their lineage through Socrates, but very few people will cite Socrates directly. They'll cite somebody who cited Socrates, right? So that's a very different sort of. So my point is, it's at least interesting to me that Jesus still has teachings that are relevant today that we are still unpacking, not just in philosophy, but in a lot of different human intellectual fields.
Well, I have two responses to that. One is, I think it's true that both Socrates and Jesus didn't leave behind any writing. So if anyone wants to quote either one of them, they'll have to quote from somebody who wrote about them. So when you say that when people quote Socrates, it's inevitable they are quoting from someone who wrote about Socrates. That's true. It's also true for Jesus, right? Because Jesus never left behind any of the writings. It's through the secondary witnesses like his disciples or the four gospels. So I'm not sure that when you bring this up, I'm not sure if that actually helps your case. And my second point is that when you talk about, for example, Socrates being most cited in philosophy and not cross-disciplinary, I am not sure why that is relevant. It sounds like you are creating an ad hoc criteria to tailor Jesus. And like here's a list of the special characteristics that Jesus' movement has, and compare to and use that as a criteria to argue for Jesus' divinity. But we could also come up with different criteria that would be true for other philosophers, but not true of Jesus. So at what point does it become just subjective and confirmation bias? That's my question for you.
Yeah, so the answer is we could come up with different criteria that would highlight different philosophers, but could we come up with any different criteria that would highlight any other religious figures? I think the answer to that question is a very clear no, right? If we're talking about people who have been relevant in the literature, that have been heavily cited, that are still teaching us new lessons today, there's nobody who comes close to Jesus from any theological system. If you want to take philosophers, that's fine if you take the example of Socrates. I think when I say that people are secondarily, tertiarily, or in a quaternary way citing Socrates, I don't mean they're citing Plato who wrote about Socrates. I mean that they're citing people who wrote about Plato, who wrote about those people, who wrote about those people. So there's many more degrees of separation. When people cite Jesus, we can talk about whether or not the statements of Jesus are really statements that Jesus made, but that's again a very different rabbit hole. I don't presuppose that the statements of Jesus in the Gospels are the statements that he actually made. I have a set of criteria that I've looked at that, major and minor criteria, mirroring what a lot of what's used in the scholarly literature. And using that analysis, I think there's at least every scholar would agree that some percentage of what Jesus taught ended up in the Gospels, and that some percentage of what's in the Gospels is, a direct teaching from Jesus, probably not verbatim, but at least a direct teaching. So, if we take at least some of those statements from Jesus, they are still relevant in a lot of different fields today. And I have examples of seminal papers in each of these fields: literature, anthropology. So again, I think looking at a comparative theological lens, the argument becomes almost undeniable. But even if you take away that lens and you say, what are the merits that Jesus was, at the very least, an intellectual figure that seems very much an outlier for human intellectual achievement, I think the argument is still quite potent. Maybe less potent, but from a comparative theological lens, I think it's almost undeniable. In other words, I can't see any theological figure measuring up in any way similar to Jesus.
Yeah, and my response to that is, I don't think it's Jesus who is making an impact. I think it's the idea of Jesus. The idea of Jesus that people have, and that makes difference in people's lives. You mentioned that you don't believe that the Gospels contain the Jesus teachings 100% authentic. You think you have your own set of criteria that distinguish some teachings to be more likely to be genuine, be more authentic than others. But wouldn't it be true that when you compare those genuine or authentic teachings to the ones that aren't, you will see that some of those not authentic teachings are still profound and wise? I'll just give you one example that just comes to my mind. When a woman was caught in adultery and was brought to Jesus and they said, Rabbi, this woman should be stoned to death. So what say you? And Jesus said, whoever is without sin can cast the first stone. That's a really wise and profound saying in response to the Jews who were trying to corner Jesus. But that episode is very likely an interpolation by later scribes, which is not original. So in other words, there are some sections in the Gospels that scholars are pretty certain are not original, and yet they still teach profound moral principles that we can all chew upon and reflect on. So are we saying that these scribes or these later traditions, the authors of these stories, are also more likely to be divine? Do you see what I'm getting at? My point is that it's not necessarily for a person to have divine attributes to come up with profound moral teachings.
Well, again, you're kind of it sounds like you're kind of granting the first part of my contention, which I think you don't mean to be granting it, which is that from a comparative theological lens, the argument is I think virtually incontestable. I mean, we could talk about that part specifically before I move on to the next part. But here's the reason why I'm asking this question, and the reason why this is important. Because often in my comment section specifically, people say, well, what about all the evidence for LDS beliefs, right? There's all this historical evidence that we have, all these kind of historical attestations behind Joseph Smith. And my point is, and this relates to the apologia debate, but it relates to a lot of other things that I talk about in my videos. Does it really matter? For instance, let's say I resurrected from the dead tomorrow and I appeared to 100 people, right? And I had them all sign notarized statements that were all witnessed, that were all like congruent and harmonious with each other. Say, okay, I've resurrected. They all agree that I've resurrected. This is a mountain of evidence, right? Well, I would still say it doesn't really matter. It's just a footnote in history unless I leave behind a teaching that's irrelevant. So in other words, if you bring to me any philosophical or theological school, my first question is going to be, do I believe in the teachings? Are they relevant? And moreover, are they enlightening in a specific way? Now, again, I'm happy to just keep the focus on a comparative theological perspective, but I can move on to answering your other question, which is, what about teachings that somebody put in? Now, Jesus had a lot of different lessons. I think there's a lot of different ways to apply those lessons to different aphoristic settings. I think it's at least very interesting that if you look at the initial Gospels, that people, and various scholars of varying degrees of theological affiliation have commented on this as well, the aphoristic density and the aphoristic nuance and the complexity and sophistication of Jesus' actual lessons are really disproportionate when we compare those to the actual writing style in which we find those lessons. In other words, if you look at Mark, everything that Mark says is written in a very, very crude way. C.H. Dodd is one person who's written a lot about this, but I do have some other examples and some notes that I have here somewhere. A lot of other people have written about this, that the sophistication of Jesus' teachings are greater than what we would expect given the sophistication of the writing style in the Gospels themselves.
That would only mean that they have different sources, and we don't know which sources contain the authentic teachings of Jesus.
I think there's at least some scholarly consensus that some percentage of the teachings in the Gospels do come from the historical Jesus. I understand your objection is we have other statements that are attributed to Jesus that may not have been attributable to Jesus, and those are very interesting statements. But let me just say the counterexample. If I found that story about the adulterous person in the Book of I don't want to pick on Mormonism specifically, but let's say any other religious text, would that really tilt me in the benefit of saying, yeah, I believe that this text now is divine in and of itself because of this one teaching? I think my argument would be no.
But
And I
that's not
think
what I'm saying, though. I'm saying, and what
you're
I'm
saying it's the
getting
idea
at
of Jesus.
is if the how do you determine that's whatever attributes of the moral teachings points to, or maybe I put it this way: how do we know that mere human beings, mere mortal, cannot come up with those profound moral principles or teachings? Because we can see some of those really profound teachings right in the Gospels, which we know are attributed to Jesus, but are not authentic.
Well, I think one simple way that we can know is look at the degree of sophistication of the teachings of Jesus and compare that to the degree of sophistication of the writing of the Gospels themselves.
Okay, I'm not going into that rabbit hole, so let's just leave that there.
That's an entire rabbit hole. Yeah, I agree. Yeah. I think you're asking a poignant question, and I don't. There's a lot of things that you've said in this debate that if I were reviewing them, I would just add a note that I think you're being very thoughtful and these are legitimate criticisms. But to me, I think you sort of haven't scathed the argument that if you think that there's an existing religion that's true, is there a case to be made that that's not a theology based on Jesus?
It's a hard question because this thought experiment is assuming that I have to pick an existing religion to be true. And there's a reason why I'm a skeptic is because I don't accept that condition, right? I don't think any of the religions in this world, in my understanding, fits my idea, my subjective idea of God if he were to exist. From my own research, all the religions that I have come to know, they are most likely human inventions rather than divinely inspired. And Christianity is not an exception. And you were talking about how Aristotle compared to Jesus, and you said that Aristotle was very for slavery.
Aristotle had horrific views about slavery
Right,
and,
but we can
subjugation of
also,
women. Yeah.
but if we try to be neutral and we look at the Gospels, there are also some problematic sayings of Jesus that Christians today don't necessarily take literally. Right.
What are some examples of things that you think that Jesus said that are problematic that Christians don't take literally?
Right. For example, Jesus says that he didn't come to bring peace to this world, but division. Right. And you can have reinterpretation of that to mean something else. But when there's this episode when a person comes to Jesus and say, Jesus, I want to follow you, but let me bury my father first. Jesus didn't say, okay, go ahead and bury your father because filial piety is important. No, he says that let the dead bury their dead. You come follow me. And that doesn't sound like he is encouraging family values there. Of course, there are also other examples that I can cite. But my main point is that when Christians read those problematic sayings, or maybe not use problematic, but hard sayings of Jesus, they would try to reinterpret those teachings to tone it down, or to maybe to interpret it so that it doesn't mean literally that way. So I'll just give you another example that in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says that whoever wants to borrow from you, you shouldn't say no. But that is almost certainly not a prudent way of handling your own finance. So much so that in Didache, reflects on that teaching, but puts a qualifier that you should let your alms sweat in your hand before you decide who to give it to. That means it's encouraging prudence, not just giving your money away to whoever asks of you. So there are, if we have confirmation bias, we would just filter out those teachings that don't apply today or we think are not so helpful. And we will keep remembering the teachings that we find are profound. And by the end of the process, we would just think that Jesus is greater than he is. That's my understanding.
Yeah, so I've studied a lot of statements of Jesus, so I want to give a little bit of pushback. We are at the
Sure.
1 hour mark, though, and I wanted to talk about some of the other things that we wanted to get into.
Okay.
But at least one of the pushback I wanted to say is some of these are not necessarily Christian interpretations, right? Some of these are neutral scholarly interpretations. For instance, Jesus saying, "I came not to bring peace, I came to bring a sword." You know, most scholars agree that what Jesus is saying here is that the pursuing of the Gospels is going to be something that entails some conflict. You know, you're going to have to, it's going to tear some families asunder. That's not necessarily a Christian interpretation. It's not like that there's not, in other words, that's a broadly accepted scholarly interpretation. But I do want to like give the chance to like talk about some of the other things that we talked about in our email chain. But I think you've raised some interesting points. I'm happy to like go over each of these quotations in more detail, and I'm happy to, you know, have you hold if you want to stick on this, but I know
we don't have much time though.
We don't have too much time.
Maximum 10 minutes. Is that okay with you? So pick one or two that you think you would like to talk about.
Well, we talked in our email chain about other topics. I don't have that email pulled up in front of me, but I'm happy to, like, are there other things? I at least wanted to address a couple of things that you said in your post. Would that be okay? One of the things that you put in your post is you compared me unfavorably to Low Bar Bill, which is a pejorative name for William Lane Craig.
Yes.
I did want to sort of push back on some of those statements a little bit. So I just wanted to be able to get to that.
Okay. Sure.
I mean, so the main reason why I wanted to push back on that is I think there is a desire in debates, particularly debates that are emotionally charged, that have the potential for acrimony, to cast the other side of the fence on some of those debates as being very homogeneous, being everyone on that side is the same. They all have the same opinion. They're all equally incorrect. So I didn't want to kind of push against that. You also said something in your post about how even though I argue that we should have scholarly standards, I'm just as happy to throw those standards away if it is harmonious with my other theological viewpoints. Now, I don't recall ever saying that, and I just wanted to like kind of address that at least a little briefly. Or if you have any other thoughts on that post and some of the other things that you said that you want to like sort of like say, well, I don't think that as much is true, or I think these are important differences, or the nuances, you're clearly different than William Lane Craig.
Yeah, I don't actually recall the second quotation that you gave because if you don't have it pulled up in front of you now, maybe it's not good to talk about it right now. Maybe we can do it later. When I made a comment that your video reminds me of Low Bar Bill, I still think so. You may think that it's pejorative, but after the conversation today, I don't think that's an unfair statement, because the impression that I get from you, even in this conversation, is that you're willing to say that, well, Jesus' moral teachings is so profound that it makes him more likely to be divine, or like other religions talk about Jesus, so he's more likely to be divine. I find this kind of arguments really weak. It's more like you already made up your mind that Jesus is somehow special, and then you try to grab all kinds of rationalizations, post hoc arguments and criteria in order to justify that belief. I still think that, because I think you would appreciate me being honest. I don't see how that is intellectually rigorous thinking. Of course, we have all those facts. Jesus teaches profound moral principles. Sure, I can agree with that. And he made a lot of impact in the world, and a lot of people are
Well,
talking about him, right?
maybe a better way to frame that claim is as follows. Do you know of any other figure in history who is, let's start with theological figures. Has any other theological figure had the moral teachings that are as resonant and still relevant today as Jesus? And
I would say that,
if you
right.
want to think about that for a moment, another way we could ask the question is there any intellectual figure from antiquity or the era before antiquity that still has intellectual relevance in multiple different disciplines, so much so that they're still cited within seminal papers of the last 100 years in several different disciplines?
Yes, so I have two responses. The first one I already given you is that it's the idea of Jesus, not necessarily Jesus himself. And also, I don't think that even if I grant that Jesus is the most impactful philosopher in the world, in the history, that means he's divine. We can have the top person in any field. Like Elon Musk is the richest person in the world. Does that make him more probable to be divine? Or there's just a lot of, I just think there's a lot of confirmation bias that's what's going on here. So,
well, let me explain this in a different way. From a comparative theological lens, the argument seems still like it's not really refuted by anything you've said. So that's one point, and we can kind of put that aside. Now, another point is you're saying like this is post hoc analysis. In other words, you decided what you thought about Jesus, and then you came up with these criteria that fit what you already thought, right? I'll just, the reason why I want to push back.
Let me go back. So when you talk about Joseph Smith, and you compare yourself, like if you resurrected from the dead tomorrow, and you left behind no like good teachings, no inspiring, no profound teaching behind, that's not, then your resurrection is nothing. But I think that's kind of a bit, that's not what we are arguing about. It doesn't matter if the teachings that you leave behind are good or bad. If we have good material evidence that you were resurrected, then you are resurrected. I see this as two different things that we shouldn't conflate together. One can be a very good moral teacher without being divine. And I don't think that being a good, profound moral teacher raises the probability that this person was raised from the dead. They are separate issues.
Well, so again, I am stating this specifically from a comparative theological lens. So what I'm saying is that there are religious figures, there are movement leaders, there are cult heroes. They rapidly fade into obscurity over varying time frames. So what makes Jesus unique is that he had lasting moral impactfulness, which is rare for cult leaders, and it's rare for resurrection cults specifically. So at least I think it's what you have to do is you have to look at Christianity through the lens of Jesus as a historical figure. So you could look through the lens of the resurrection accounts, but I think if you just hyper focus on the resurrection itself and you say people can't rise from the dead, then I think that's not very nourishing. I think you sort of are missing the context of Jesus as a teacher, Jesus as a radical, Jesus as a revolutionary, Jesus as a thinker, Jesus as a philosopher. So now my second point is it does align with what we would expect, as I stated from the beginning, for a divinely inspired figure. We would expect not just deeds that are miraculous, but views that are galvanizing and ideas that are potent. So now we often do use these sort of sequential decision forests in our daily lives. Now, the only thing I wanted to say is just give a little bit of pushback on this being post hoc analysis. I did give you other major arguments. These were mostly arguments that I discovered as an atheist. So these are interesting arguments that I discovered as an atheist. These are not arguments that I said, well, I believe in Jesus because of my own personal experiences, and now I'm going to come up with some criteria that justify my pre-existing belief. It's a minor point, but it's a significant one.
Okay, so I will give you, so for the sake of time, but I'll just add one point. In your minimal facts for Christianity, the reason why I think that is kind of like a post hoc analysis, that's kind of rationalization, is that I just don't see how any of these 10 facts have any correlation with the veracity of Christianity being true, that Jesus being more likely to be divine. For example, the fact number 7, stories about Jesus spread through person-to-person evangelism. No, it's not that. It's the apologia.
That's Apologia's
Yeah.
minimal
So
facts.
let me scroll down. So Jesus is the only figure explicitly named in canonical Jewish literature who is described as performing wondrous acts without invoking the authority of God. And when I read that, I was like, so what? That just means he is being hated by many people, right? And many people try to discredit him by saying that he relies on demons or he's a sorcerer, which is kind of the norm of during the ancient time. When you try to discredit somebody, you don't say that they did nothing. You say that they were with the demons, with the devil, and they were performing magic by the power of the demons. So that's one of the reasons why I think that all of this feels like a post hoc rationalization.
Well, so here are some important facts, though. We know that there were magicians in the era of antiquity who did claim to have magical abilities who were debunked, right? So people said, you don't have any magical abilities, and they were subsequently debunked. Alexander of Abonoticus is an often cited example. Lucian of Samosata, I think, said, like, this guy is not doing any miracles. He's not doing anything that's particularly interesting, right? And there's various other examples. For instance, even in the oracles, we know that oracles were known for their divination, but we also know that that divination could be debunked by erroneous predictions. And when those erroneous predictions happened, those oracles fell out of favor. So my point is this. With every other miraculous account that we find in the theological literature across every single theology, we never find an antagonistic testimonial that supports the argument. So from the standpoint of historical scholarship, again, from the standpoint of comparative theological analysis, I think this makes the point very strongly. But let's put that aside for a moment and look from the standpoint of historical analysis. When we see as historical scholars that there are different narratives that align with certain viewpoints, that suggests to us that we're moving towards a contemporaneous understanding. We don't often have any antagonistic statements around. Christianity is actually the only theological narrative that has antagonistic statements from other religious traditions, from people who did not believe in Christianity, who did not believe in Jesus, who are putting forth testimony which is harmonious with Christian accounts. In other words, it seems at least surprising that the people who were arguing against Christianity were not arguing that Jesus is not a healer, right? They weren't arguing that Jesus is not miraculous. They were just arguing that Jesus performs his magic without divine authority. I think that's at least very interesting. We don't actually find
Simon Magus, right? In Acts,
no, that's not true. Actually, Simon Magus is never attested to by any other traditions. We know about Simon Magus from Acts. We know that he was at least some sort of a pretender to be a magician, but we don't have any antagonistic sources about Simon Magus. We don't have any
Acts. Acts is antagonistic source.
And what is the protagonistic source towards Simon Magus? Right. Well, the point is we don't have any different viewpoints. It wasn't
left because only very few of the ancient literature were left for us to be discovered. So
well, that's true, but I mean, we can go across religious traditions. We don't, in any religious tradition, every religious tradition starts with some sort of miracle accounts. Right?
I think this is what I'm getting at, right? You're making up all this kind of post hoc or ad hoc arguments. I give you an example of an ancient account accusing Simon Magus of committing sorcery, and you say, where is the protagonist?
So my point is,
so what?
No, my point is we only have one account of Simon Magus.
Well, actually, there's another account where I think it's an apocryphal Gospel of Peter or something that also talks about Simon Magus. So it's not
I
just
mean,
one
I'll have to
account.
look that up. I would still say that's within the umbrella of the early Christian literature, at least at the time.
Apocryphal Acts of Peter. Now, where it says that Simon
Not
Magus
canonical
can fly
Christian,
or levitate.
Here's my point. This isn't a criteria that I came up with, right? And these reasons do work convergently, right? And they work best from a comparative theological lens. But historical scholars do say when we see antagonistic sources that are pointing at harmonious observations from different sources, that we that tells us that we're looking at something that was a contemporaneous understanding, right? So in other words, let me put it to you this way: if we have different sources that say that an earthquake occurred, right, from two different sides, and one says the earthquake occurred to strike these people down, and the other people say, well, the earthquake occurred for this different reason, historians will still say we have different sources arguing for this earthquake. So you're right. I shouldn't say strictly antagonistic. So I think that's constructive criticism because Simon Magus is in that category. But this is not me coming up with a post hoc rationalization. This is what historical scholars have come up with as a standard. Do we have antagonistic literature?
But no, these are
in other
facts,
words, do we have multiple perspectives?
But it's you who are doing post hoc or ad hoc arguments by using these facts to increase the probability of Jesus being divine or Christianity being true.
Let's see if we can find some consensus, right? So I'm willing to accept that the example of Simon Magus is an interesting counterpoint. I would argue that for Simon Magus, we still don't have other sources that attest to what his skills or abilities were, right? So, but I can see you saying, well, you're just defending your argument. My reason for saying why this is not post hoc rationalization is because for many of the conclusions in my minimal facts video and in the opening statement that I gave you, I was reaching these conclusions as an atheist. So it's not like I said, I believe in Jesus. Now let's find some weird ways where we can unscrupulously associate these criteria to Jesus. So that's the only reason I'm giving you pushback on that point.
Okay.
But let's move towards some consensus.
Okay.
And I agree. Your point is that saying that we have to pick an existing theological system to be true is a contrived thought experiment. I think that's a valid criticism. That's not going to be appealing for every audience. But I still think that these facts do work convergently to at least point in a specific direction. Now, you have some really interesting arguments between atheism and theism on your channel. I'd love to engage some more with those. It wasn't one of the topics that we got to today, but we can see how this video does. But if you have any further reflections on, from a comparative theological lens, is there a better candidate that we can pick than a theology based on Jesus? That's that's maybe something that we can keep talking about in other.
Right. So we are running out of time. So very briefly, so if we are trying to do comparative religion, we have to have a set of criteria. And the problem the reason why I'm struggling with this hypothetical question is because I don't know which set of criteria that I'm supposed to use. If I'm supposed to use the set of criteria I'm using now, then I cannot say any of the religions is likely to be true. And if I were to use a set of criteria that is not mine, but given to me, then I wouldn't see the point of asking me this hypothetical question.
Okay, well, let's just bring up one last point, and this is not related to that because I think we probably won't find a lot of consensus on this particular issue, but I'm just quoting from your post. What stood out to me most wasn't the pile of facts. It was his own framing more than once. He essentially takes off his scholarly hat to make his final evaluation. He concedes that if he sticks strictly to a historical lens, he isn't sure he could still affirm the resurrection as historical, and he leans toward probably not believing it. Now, I do think that's a little bit of an unfair characterization. In other words, I never take off my scholarly hat to make my final evaluation. The point of taking off my scholarly hat was just to say, this is where I'm coming from theologically so that you understand my current degree of bias. I think that's something that doesn't happen enough. But so I do think that this post is at least a little bit misleading and somewhat misunderstanding. So I was kind of hoping you would want to look at this post and maybe clear some stuff up about that particular aspect of the post.
Right. So you said that if you were to keep the scholar's hat on, you probably wouldn't believe in Jesus' resurrection or that Christianity is true. But is it
So
true?
I
Apparently,
think
that you
I
are
think
you.
I think what I'm saying is like let me take off my scholarly hat and tell you what my own personal beliefs are. Now, the reason why I wanted to do that, and maybe I could have gone into this in more depth, is because you do have a lot of apologists like, Wesley Huff, who, is a very interesting thinker, but he points out that he sort of points out that his perspective is theological, but it's sort of hard when you're listening to him talk to keep track of when he's speaking as a scholar and when he's speaking as a minister or pastor. By the same token, on the other side of the debate, I think you have people like Richard Carrier, who says, my life goal is to advance the cause of atheism, right? So when he talks about Christianity, it's similarly hard to know if he's speaking as a scholar or speaking with someone who, from the perspective of someone who has the specific goal to advance atheism. Anyways, in other words, my point was, let me tell you where I'm coming from so that you understand my own personal perspective on this, so you can judge for yourself if that biases my scholarly conclusion. I just wouldn't want anyone to get the impression after reading this quote that I have to take off my scholarly hat to make my final evaluation. In other words, I have to pretend to stop being an academician in order to come up with a conclusion that is congruent with my pre-existing beliefs. That's something that I would obviously
So,
oppose for obvious
right.
reasons.
Okay.
I often speak against it.
Right. So you're saying that you don't have to take off your scholarly hat to arrive at your present conclusion about Christianity and Jesus?
No, I think the major facts that I'm laying out, I think
Mhm.
I think they kind of speak for themselves. I mean, look, I'm not, you know the Bible better than I do. You've been an atheist on YouTube for longer than I have. I've only been on YouTube for about 6 months. Your videos are all fantastic. You're an extremely accomplished, well versed thinker and speaker, and your channel's really great. So I think that these facts sort of speak for themselves in some ways, because I'm not a particularly good speaker. I'm not a particularly good debater. This is kind of the first debate that I've really had, essentially. So I I think the fact that if these facts come through in the argument and the debate between us, that speaks to the strength of the facts alone, rather than the strengths of my abilities or as a rhetorician.
Okay. Thank you, Tavo, for having this conversation with me. Audience, please check out Tavo's channel and subscribe to his channel. And if you haven't subscribed to my channel, please do so. Thank you, audience. And I hope this conversation has been helpful for you as well. Please leave some comments on what you think is the strongest and the weakest point of each of us. Have a good day, and thank you for listening.
One more thing I just wanted to say really quick, if it's okay, Sheng.
Okay, sure.
Just your channel's really great. I've been watching a lot of your videos over the last few weeks. You have some really fascinating content that we didn't get into. So even if you disagree with what Sheng has said in this debate, please check out his channel. It's really very fascinating. He makes a lot of cases very, very persuasively. And Sheng, I do hope that this is like the first conversation of many that we have. I think you're really outstanding as a scholar and as a thinker. And there are a lot of things that you've said on your channel that I wanted to engage with a lot more. So I hope we have the chance to speak much further in the future. And I'm really grateful that you've agreed to have this conversation with me. I really feel like you're providing a seat at a table, which is for people with much bigger YouTube followings and much bigger channels than I have. So I'm super grateful to be on here. I didn't want to let the video close out without expressing my gratitude and really underscoring it.
Thank you. That's a flattering comment, and I just don't think that I am that good enough yet. But still, thank you for your kind words. And folks, that's the end of this interview. Thank you for listening, tuning in, and we will see you next time.